Okay. Hello everyone. Let's let's go for this. By the way, this is the first time I'm giving a full speak in English about my topic, so please don't be too severe. uh, yeah. Uh, okay. So far so good. This is the title of my PhD thesis: Design and Implementation of Neuromorphic Processing Platform for Robot Control Systems. As many of you guys already know, my background is more rather a control theory guy, an electrical engineering guy, rather than a computer science engineer. So, well, one thing that I've noticed when I was working in robotics is that the throughput of processors, you have a latency quite high when you are trying to process a lot of information inputs, right? So this is where neural networks came to mind because usually on robotics you need the ability to learn, the ability to find new abilities into path navigation or especially on mobile robotics such as autonomous driving, that kind of stuff. You have to learn on the fly. So usually you end up implementing everything in maybe one development board such as Raspberry Pi, such as that, and it ends it ends up being like if you want to plot all your graphs and record all your data, you usually end up with your laptop tied to a wire to your robot. So of course something has to be done regarding the throughput of the devices and how we can enable these algorithms in a fast manner, right? So this is the content of the presentation. First, I will start talking about some neuron dynamics because this is where the starting point when you try to build computers which behave similar to the brain with 20 watts uh, of consumption during the day is able to perform amazing tasks to process a lot of information, and sometimes you haven't even got any breakfast. So how we can achieve this amazing throughput, this amazing performance in all terms, not only on power consumption but also on operations of on Mac operations or maybe floating point operations, right? So then we are starting with neuron dynamics. Then I will summarize what will happen with encoding signals into spikes because all our information now we are encoding into binary signals. You will see that there is some point where these both approaches meet. Then we will speak about learning in spiky neural networks, how we can build functions with neural blocks, uh, some offline learning approaches, such as maybe you train the model first and then you grade them into a chip, or online learning manner, which is the matter of my concern regarding my thesis, which is you can do a chip which can learn on the fly with all these benefits of low power consumption and this kind of stuff. And then we are moving into implementing spiky neural networks in hardware. First, we are aiming for analog dynamics, and then we move forward into current implementations in digital technology, where I think here uh, we can meet some opportunities to collaborate, or maybe you guys who are working in similar fields might find more useful rather than going full neuronal dynamics. And yeah, finally we are ending with some opportunities on SNN research. So I know you guys are busy for today, so let's speed it up this. Um, Neuron dynamics, you are kind of familiar with this. If we move to the biological machinery behind this, you will find that you have ions of potassium, ions of sodium, ions of calcium interacting between the interior and exterior of the neuron. The nucleus of the neuron, it's called soma, receives a lot of input spikes of voltage, which can be, of course, when we talk about voltage crossing across a synapse, you can see this as an input spike potential, so the spikes of current, right? So these spikes of current gets accumulating into the soma at some point that it overpasses a certain threshold value. a certain potential value where the neuron decides to emit the spikes and emit it from the inside through the outside, right? So this threshold value here, as soon as you overpass this, you'll notice that you will emit a spike. There are several models to model all this biological machinery. The most famous one is the Hutchin and Huxley algorithm, which, well, not algorithm, model, which is consistent on four differential equations with hundreds of parameters. All of these modeling, uh, for instance, amount of concentration of ions of calcium, potassium, conductivity, Mellin sheets. The Mellin sheets are these little like sheets, these little cushions that replicate the signal through the axon. The presence or absence of these Mellin sheets make the synapse increase or decrease the conductivity. So, yeah, as I mentioned, there are several models. Hodgkin and Huxley, which is the one I've mentioned, is as you can see, this graph is created by Eugene Sikevich, which is one of the best authors regarding this topic, spiking neural networks. He's more close to neurobiology rather than computer science. However, he's kind of like a mix in both worlds. He mentions that biological plausibility, which is how much the model reflects the true dynamics of a neuron, you can set to poor at the top of good at the bottom, right? So you can see Hutchin and Huxley is good and also prohibitive regarding number of flops per floating operating uh, floating operating sorry a number of flops per second, which consists into how many multiplication and addition operations occur in a second. So for the Hodgkin and Huxley, it's at least more than 100 per neuron. Now imagine if you want to implement a huge model with hundreds nor thousands of neurons. This is vastly prohibitive in currently uh, architectures, right? There we neuroscientists start to explore simplifications regarding such as maybe we are not, uh, by the way, the Hutchin-Huxley model has been obtained by opening the head uh, what is this? I know the animal is named in Spanish, but I don't know a squid. The head of a squid. Uh, they measured with electrodes in the head. They measured the spikes and obtained this model. So several of these simplifications of the model relies on, such as we are not caring about the dynamics of for instance, the brain of certain species. Maybe we are more interested about the mammals' brains. So this is what Eugene Sikevich made and was able to reduce this prohibitive costly model into a highly efficient and good biological plausibility. However, at the end of the day, what we do have is a neuron that emit or not emit the spikes. This is all we care. Of course, Isikevich reflects several kinds of types of spikings which are reflected in Hutchin and Huxley. But as we will see at the next slides, maybe the patterns of spikes doesn't uh, are not that important regarding to modify synaptic weights. You'll see what I mean in the coming slides. So one of the simplest is integrate and fire. Leaky integrate and fire or model leaf. Let's move to the next slide. Resembles the similarity between a neuron and a resistance and capacitance circuit, a low pass filter, if you can see. The idea is that input spikes of current arrives here, starts to accumulate the charge into this capacitance, and the capacitance uh, reaches its full capacity. And here is when, well, here at this drawing, maybe I have to mention that sometimes it's included something like this. and now you include the capacitance. When certain threshold value happens, which is consistently the same value as the full capacity of the capacitance, the the switch opens, and then you will be able to emit a spike. So if you model, this is the differential equation. It's a first order differential equation where we have the voltage of the membrane, which is this variable, relies into a resting potential voltage, the current voltage of the neuron, and so this is Ohm's law, the input excitation current, and a resistance, this resistance. So you can select the values of resistance, of capacitance, and where here is the capacitance here at this model, in this value tau m. Remember it that for this kind of circuits, T equals R times C. So you can select the dynamics, and the condition is this one is the sorry I'm okay here. The condition is that as soon as you hit a certain value, the neuron will spikes and the voltage has to reset again, as you can see at this graph. This is the excitation input current. As soon as the excitation input current starts to fill with charge the capacitance starts charging with a certain delay imposed by this variable, and then it quickly decharges, right? So as you can see, this condition, which is stated by an if, is non-differentiable. It's the function activation of the neuron. And as you know, the function activation has to be differentiable in order so you can apply backpropagation. So by default, you cannot apply backpropagation in your spiky neural networks. Of course, there are some articles which, instead of using these if conditions, they use certain sigmoidal functions or smooth functions that will be able to make the approximations for backpropagation. However, there is certain controversy in researches in neuromorphic computing, because another goal of studying all of this is how we can simulate or make digital twins of brains in order to study neuronal dynamics. This is not only for computer science purposes, but also for neurobiologist studies, right? So uh, the point here is, what I'm trying to say is, how is really backpropagation happening, or is the learning mechanism embedded in the brains? Maybe not. We have found it useful into computer science uh, fields, but not into neurodynamics. So yeah, it is. This is another alternative, and we will talking about this later. But yeah, now as you can see here at this graph, here I have the current of excitation in nanoamperes and the spike frequency in hertz. As you can see, there's certain value which is called Rieux. When the Rieux happens when the frequency of spike becomes 1, how much current do you need? So you will give even a frequency rate of 1 hertz. So at this value, this is called Rieux. And then it starts to move to grow. So as you can see, this function is not linear. It is more than logarithmic. I don't know if you agree with me. So it is non-linear, right? So yeah, this is Slick Integrate and Fire. Let me see what we move forward. Well, as you have seen, neurons care about input current of excitation. They do not care about signals. However, what we do care is about signals or values or the intensity of a pixel in our camera. So we have to convert the vector input of our data into a proportional current in order to do excitation. Here is where we move forward into the next topic, into this chat, and we start with encoding. The idea is that the most simple one, and maybe you have be able to figure out in the past slide, is red-based encoding. which means uh, it's just a rule of thumb that an interpolation, sorry, where you have a minimum value and a maximum value. And also you can set a minimum current of excitation and a maximum current of excitation. So you can just decide a linear correspondence between these and set a linear proportional current to feed a neuron, one neuron. So as you can see here, this is one article I've made up in the past year with my colleagues at IPN. And here you can see that this red-based encoding determines how much current you have to feed to each neuron in order to trigger. The more the current, the more higher is the value you want to represent, and higher is the spiking frequency, sorry. You see? So this is the most basic one. However, this is not really how brain works. Of course, if you as a human, as an animal, experiment higher input signals, your neurons will fire faster, of course. But there are some other approaches who scientists of the brain have found, such as temporal encoding or time-based encoding schemes. Well, this one is the one we just checked, red-based. But now let's check this one. This one is called time to first spike, which means that you have certain period called t, and during this period you want to encode certain value of a signal, right? So the larger is x, the shorter the time it will take to the neuron to spike. So for really high values, the neuron will spike immediately. For very low input values, the neuron will spike at the last stages of this period. And it will only cause one spike per period. You see my point? So they have, this is another way to encode information. Also another way is temporal encoding. But before we to move out into move forward, sorry, into temporal encoding, I would like to also discuss this idea. I mean, DACs and ADCs, they do provide the spikes, but in a shaped manner as a binary number. If it only consists in to emit a single spike of voltage, you can use this binary word and some circuitry to feed or not feed neurons. So if you want to spike, if you want to provide current to an input to an array of neurons, you can set 4 input neurons and provide current to each one of them according the output word. So this is another possible of encoding. And there are some articles which are already also addressing this, not for one neuron, for several neurons. And we will check also in the next slide that there is another approach. Now, what? Yes. Yes, it should be right. Right, and also I'm seeing that time to first spike the most one to be realizable into a circuit, and the most efficient, of course, because as we have seen in the in this associated processor project, the DACs and the ADCs are the throughput is not the most efficient, and also you have a quantization error. The ideal would be that if you have a bit length of infinite, this will cause into no quantization error. However, you will be always be lacking of this because if you make a DAC or an ADC with a really high output word, you should be ending to a large device. So this is not the performance of this, the consumption, the power consumption. You have to. We are trying to move forward into power consumption. However, this time to first spike, it is not the most efficient. We also can have this one, temporal coding. Temporal encoding relies, and I think we can move forward in the next slide. Now imagine this scheme, this one I'm about to point. Here we have two leaf neurons. Each neuron will receive its proper input current by some block called encoder. This encoder you can set a certain threshold value. Let's set X threshold and the input threshold and the input signal. Sorry. So the encoder, what it consists is it compares the input signal against the threshold signal. If it is for a certain period, of course. If in this period the input signal is larger than the threshold signal, it will emit a spike for this neuron, or it can emit current for during this period of time, which can consist into a square input current. You see my point? Case contraire, the opposite case. What if the input signal is smaller than the threshold value? Now we defeat the other neuron. You'll see my point. Once this time step has occurred, for the next time step you have to update this threshold value, because if the signal is constant, the input signal is constant, the encoder should not emit excitation current if the signal hasn't changed. You see my point? This is also being studied for neurobiologists into that the plasticity of cortical neurons, realizing that if the excitatory signals remains constant, even if they are large, the spike response is reduced, which in other words might sound like if the environment is constant, the neuron activity will decrease. So as you can see here at these graphs, here I'm using as a sinusoidal signal input, and the orange one, the orange line, is the output signal provided by an decoder. The decoder, as you can imagine, is the opposite of the encoder. If this neuron spikes, this increases an output baseline. If the negative neuron spikes, this decreases the output signal. So as you can see, it has a high. You can easily implement this with an exponential, with a differential pair, maybe a comparator, maybe I don't know, this kind of cell which compares voltage against threshold, analog design. This is a purely analog design. But now we are introducing encoders as another analog block. And as you can see, here are the resulting spikes for the positive neuron and for the negative neuron. When, as you can see, when the signal is increasing, this positive neuron spikes. As soon as you hit the highest point, the neuron will start decreasing, you see? So now the signal will start decreasing. Therefore, the negative neuron will start to spike. So now you have two neurons spiking for different regions of the signal. Do you see my point? Okay, so this is temporal encoding, and also is easy. I think it's most plausible to implement this and these devices into analog design. You see my point? Rather than time to first spike. However, time to first spike is also promising, and which one would you think that will be most efficient regarding power consumption? Time to first spike, because you are just setting a boundary of one spike per period, while this one will emit spikes as soon as the signal is changing. However, what if your input signal the variability of your input signal does not change that much? The time to first spike will still emitting spikes even the signal is not changing, rather than the temporal encoding the spike will not emit spikes as the signal is not changing. So which one is more plausible? This it is open debate. You see my point? But this is why there are different schemes. Yes, yes, and I think that's the main point because so far as I know or so far as I've read, there is no way to measure how much information are we encoding. Like, of course, you can get the quantization error of these couple of signals, right? And then you can do the comparison between both signals and obtain a power comparison in decibels and then check out. However, here I just have one neuron for positive, one neuron for negative. I will always have quantization error. So a theory which properly models the amount of information with the spikes is still lacking. So I'm not able to answer you that question because there is no theory such as in binary that you can determine the amount of information with the equation, the bit width, and that kind of stuff. You see my point? Okay. Now how we do go back into this scheme into this scheme. The idea is that when this neuron fires, the decoder also has a signal baseline. I will use this notation. So, and this signal basal starts with a value of 0. So currently the decoder output is 0. This neuron spikes. Now, the decoder, what it happens is, as this neuron spiked, the new value in the next time step will be the previous one plus a slight delta, and you can set this delta as high or as low as you want. Here, for instance, I select this delta in a higher manner just to depict what the encoder and decoder is doing, but you can also select it as small as you want. It can be zero point 0.1 or it can be 0.0001 or as exactly exactly, and you can decide that delta as small as you can. However, you don't have any, or how can you assemble an information theory equation with this, right? You see my point? So there are also some actually we were talking about this yesterday, Mariam. I don't know if you remember that one professor at Mexico told me that this is an area opportunity for research, how you can depict information theory with the spikes. So now we are moving forward because there is yes, 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 yes. Go ahead. Right, we are not having a clock that repeats in every time. We are working in a continuous manner. However, do you remember in the previous slide the time for first spike? We are setting a period. So this is the idea of setting a clock. This is why our time based. You see my point? But we can work with this in a continuous manner, of course. You see my point? But if we are working in a continuous manner, then we can move into rate-based encoding. Or we can use the most accepted one encoding scheme, which is called population encoding. In the previous encoding scheme, we had two neurons, and one neuron spiked for positive values, and the other neuron spiked for negative values. What if instead of only two neurons, we had more? And if here we have as an input signal called x, which relies between a minimum and a maximum. You can set here the maximum, and you can set here the minimum. Now, you can divide this range of values into several values of quantization, such as in typical binary theory, right? Information theory. You can divide this whole range into quantization levels. Now, what you want is that each neuron spikes for certain region between this whole range. So you can decide that the first neuron, this one, spike for values near this range. The second neuron spike for regions for this range, and so on and so forth. Also, you can decide that maybe let's assign some numbers, -1 and 1, and we are splitting the whole range between four regions. Sorry. So when the value is the input value is minus 0.5 and only exactly minus 0.5, you can have that this neuron spike if you only have 4 neurons. However, you can also assign Gaussian distribution, normal distribution. The point is that if this Gaussian distribution have a mean and a variance, which determines how thick or how slim is this Gaussian. You see my point? So what will happen is if the Gaussian is as thin as possible, the neuron will only spike when this value occurs. You see? Or you can set this Gaussian as thick as possible. The idea is that if the input signal relies between this value and this value, you can have 2 neurons spiking. Now, this was an easier case with just 4 neurons, but in reality you can have as many neurons as you want. The more the better, because in this manner you will guarantee that at least some neurons will spike during for any input signal. You see my point? So how you can accomplish this? Let's move this from a theoretical point of view, because of course if you code this in Python it's straightforward. However, we are moving into neuromorphic computing now. How we can assemble a circuit which behaves like this? The straightforward idea would be assign random weights, and these random weights you can assign them prior training, and you will also want that a systematic offset in such a manner as we have in here, that this offset will represent this movement, right? The idea is that this neuron fires for the later values of the range. These neurons spike for the middle values of the range, and so on and so forth. So what I can depict here is that these neurons have an input current biased. You see, like the input current this neuron can also be added a bias, and this is easily done in analog circuitry. You see my point? However, what's the main counterback of this? The resistance. What will happen when you add resistance in your circuit? Power consumption, heat problems due to Joule heating, right? And now remember that the more neurons, the better. However, the more neurons, the more synapses. You see my point? So there is a compromise between how many neurons do you want to use and to encode your signal, and the precision you want to have, such as with DACs and ADCs. And DACs we were talking about a bit width, the larger the better. Now, do you remember that we've talked about using DAX and having something like this, a binary word? Well, if the input value x is encoded with a digital word such as this, what will correspond with the exact same thing? The third neuron will spike. So you can see that binary coding is like another version of this encoding methodology, which by the way it has a name. It is called LSHDI principle. Or I forgot what it stands for, but linear solution of higher dimensional um, systems, which means that you have a nonlinear system dynamics which you can represent in a linear manner when you do overpooling of the signals, which means if you have here an input signal x in R3, for instance, but x in R3 are based in a space-state manner which is nonlinear, you can find a linear representation of the exact same system, but higher dimensional. Let's call this other representation, I don't know, y, but y relies maybe in a number, I don't know, 10. And this is also Koopman, this is called Koopman theory. But now we are getting into control theory rather than information theory. You see my point? So let's get back to the main point of discussion. Okay, we have neuron dynamics, we have synapses, we have resistance. How can I assemble everything into create a computer thing? A box with input signals, with when to certain input, you obtain an output. This is the main goal, right? And this is why we create AND gates, OR gates, NOR gates, XOR gates, which combined you can produce any function you want. This is the main goal. Now, how can you assemble leaf neurons? How can you assemble synapses, which by the way I haven't talked how these are modeled? How can you assemble encoders to obtain this? So the basic idea is that you can have this main block, and by the way, this block is not my proposal; is a proposal for a lot of researchers before. One of them is called um, Chris Elias-Smith. I'm also giving you some names of some researchers in order if you are curious about this, you can also check Aaron Volker. Sorry, it's just V. Also Alois Knoll. Sorry. Right, so these are some one of the most important names into this theory. So yeah, the idea is that in order to create any function, you can start with a structure such as this. You have this input vector, and the input vector has as many input neurons as your signal is large, right? If your input signal is a vector of, I don't know, 3 signals, you should have 3 input neurons. Then you have a hidden layer of neurons, which, by the way, this has to be into a higher dimension than the input signal. It has to be higher or at least equal. You see my point? The idea is for this principle, the, the linear solution of high dimensional systems. And then you have an output layer which dimensionality resides into the signals of interest you want to obtain. Of course, this can be as larger as you want, but what is the point? The idea is that you want to represent this into all the categories you want. This is very common into a categorization task that at the output layer you have a neuron for each category of you want to discretize. You see my point? So the idea is that Here I'm using certain representation. Uh, Here I have, if I know the function I want to map, let's say fx equals 2 times x, right? Then I declare a vector x, which is just a sample of numbers, I don't know, minus 3, minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Uh, my question is, do I know the output? Yes, because as I do know the function, I can compute the output based on this function, right? So you will have here minus 6, minus 2, and so on and so forth. So I do know the input and I do know the output, right? Sorry, I'm moving forward. Therefore, you can compute, also again, we are defining these weights randomly initial in order to obtain that Gaussian distribution of the signal. So the main point is now you have to find this matrix of weight values in order that the input signal you are obtaining here is the desired output signal. So if you check here this transfer function, the output signal relies into W, the matrix weight of the second layer, right? And H, what is H? Let me speed up a little bit because I think I'm moving too slowly. The idea is that if you have this input signal, this neuron will start to spike. Let's assume that this is red-based spiking. So these spikes start to move into all of these neurons according to the pondering that the weights are assuming. For certain time step, you have this output vector H. H is the output voltage of each of one of these neurons. You see my point? So at certain time steps, so which shape has H? Imagine you have your time 10 seconds with a delta time of 1 second. Which size will be H of x? So for the first time step, you will have 8 signals. For the second time step, you will also have another set of 10 signals. So it will be 10 times m, where m is the number of neurons in the second layer. You see my point? So it isn't the square. Of course, if you have 10 neurons in your hidden layer, of course it will be squared. So now, if you know the input, you know the output, you can let this system run, record the neural activity of the neurons, and obtain H, which, by the way, we said that it is not the square. So as we are trying to find the weights, you can add the transpose here in both sides. Then this matrix definitely will be squared, so you can compute an inverse. Now, I'm making here an assumption, as you can see, right? And then the estimated output will be, let's denotate estimated such as the signal that I compute previously when I was scrambling, making some writing so on the side of my slide, right? So you know the estimated output, you know the actual output, so you can define an error. The error will be the actual output minus the expected output. However, the expected output is this value, so you can replace at this equation. Once you are replacing, you will find out that y appears both times, so you can factorize. And here you end up with the identity matrix, and here you are ending up now with the pseudo inverse matrix, right? Now, if the matrix H is full rank, which means is that any column is not a zero value, all the values of that column, uh, then you will have an invertible matrix, and then you will be able to find the value of these weights. So why, if this is not accomplishable, You cannot do it. Now this is why neurons, neural networks are get beneficiated with noise, right? Because the only requisite is that the metrics shouldn't have any values zero, but this can be near to zero, prone to noise, right? So this will be an offline manner of learning. If you see, you don't have to do online learning. You know the input and you know the output already. You can define these neural structures and build your functions. So now you can build functions in this manner. So as you can see, this is quite different for the things that now as computologists are we doing, right? And this is one of the articles I've written in the past when I was starting to study neural networks. Here I've implemented an LQR control, which is a typical control strategy which undergrads study into their studies. So I do obtain a function called UDX, which is kind of seen like a certain value times E, where E is the error of the reference, which is represented here as dot, and the actual robot. So the idea is that this function, I obtained it with typical control theory, prior manner, right? With deterministic values. Now that I know the function, I just represent everything with the spiking to prove this works. And as you can see, it worked. Here I simulated a segue, and I was able to control the segue using input and output of the spikes. Here this network is not learning because it doesn't have to. You have already determined the value of this function, right? So this is how you can embed functions using spiking neural networks, right? But what I do care about is online learning. This is the main attraction, because if you already know the function, what's the point of even of neural networks? You see my point? So the most biological plausible rule which has been found is spike time dependent plasticity, which means that, sorry, you have two neurons tied by a synapse. Sorry, this is not a diode, a synapse, something like that, right? So this neuron, presynaptic neuron, which I will call presynaptic neuron, and this neuron, which is called postsynaptic neuron, this neuron spikes. This neuron also spikes. So at a certain point, these spikes travel and meet at the center of the synapse, right? So as you can see here in this diagram, you have two cases. When the presynaptic spike arrives first, than the postsynaptic spike, as you can see, right? So both the neurons are spiking. As these spikes have certain voltage, you can do the difference. You can map the difference between both spikes and obtain the graph down here. You see my point? Now, the synapses have certain threshold value. These synapses will not increase or decrease if this threshold value is not achieved. What I mean is that if this signal relies always inside these two threshold values, any synaptic change will happen. However, if you overpass this, now it's not undoing. If you overpass this, the spike used at the moment of the convolution, this will overpass the voltage effective, and it will provoke that the resistance or the conductance of the synapse modifies itself, right? Or increases or decreases. Actually, we have here the both cases. Here, it is when the value of the synaptic will increase, which is called long-term postalization. And the other case, when the second spike, the postsynaptic spike, arrives first and the presynaptic spike arrives later. Now, when you do the convolution of both signals, the overpass of the threshold is on the other side. You see my point? Now, instead of a weight increasing, the weight will decrease. You can map this function such as this. And actually, this has been proven with actual measurements in the brain that you can obtain a function such as this. Of course, this also has a problem. I don't know if you noticed. It's not differentiable at 0, you see? So, of course, there are some approximations where instead of having this, they do depict a function such as this. And this one is differentiable, but this has to be a fixed, the slope should be fixed. This is what I'm trying to say. So all these convolutions of voltage are reflected with this model, right? And in this article, they've fed with impulses to a certain input layer of neurons, and they were able to engrave into the synapses the patterns of the MNIST classification. You see my point? The red are the synapses with larger conductance values, and in blue are the synapses with lower conductance values. And you can see clearly that you can map the patterns, right? Now, the idea is that STDP, or spike time dependent plasticity, is an unsupervised learning methodology. I don't know if you guys see why. It is unsupervised because it only relies on the input signal X, but you are not giving any reward signal to correct the neural network. You are not providing it. You are just providing an input signal and see how the neural network evolves. So there is also another contribution of this learning method, which is called RSTDP, which is called reward modulated STDP, which relies on some observations that neurobiologists have made regarding dopamine values. So these dopamine values can be mapped as a signal R between -1 and 1, which -1 can be related as absence, completely lack absence of dopamine, and 1 can be full dopamine. So you can conditionate the behavior. So instead of growing, it can, if instead of doing long-term potentiation, you can obtain long-term uh, depression. Okay. Yes.
So basically, what this so if you want to summarize this into one sentence, is it that this learning model relies on the fact that neurons that fire together wire together?
Exactly. This is called Hebbian learning, and I know you are quite familiar with this. Maybe if I am maybe repeating myself too much, please address it. I'm trying to improve also my my presentation skills. But yeah, the idea is that you have two neurons firing together, and the closer the spikes occur, it will increase or decrease the rate of change into the weight value, right? If the presynaptic neuron fires first, it will potentiate the synapse. If the postsynaptic neuron spikes first, it will depreciate the synapse. However, the spikes have to occur in the same period. The best divider, the shorter divider, in order to achieve this behavior, the convolution. Because if just one neuron is spiking and this voltage effective is not overpassed, there will be no learning. You see my point? Okay, now here is where I can move a little bit forward, because all of this can be implemented both in hardware and in software. Here is an article. Here's an article where they implemented a model to the MNIST classification task. They trained a model with typical neural networks implemented in a computer, digital computer, GPU. They obtained the weight values, and then they engraved it in an analog manner. So instead of using resistance, they used optical attenuators, which the only thing is that an input signal is represented as a photonic signal, light. And this optical attenuator, the only thing it does is reduce the flow of optical input. So it acts as a resistance of light. You see my point? And here you are affecting a diode and a transimpedance amplifier, and this can be depicted as your neuron, and these are your synapses. And this chip is able to process 1.7 billion images per second, as it is purely analog. Now tell me which digital chip achieves this kind of processing, the speeds. What's the catch? The catch is that this, this hardware implementation is not able to learn. Once you have engraved these weights, you cannot change them. You see my point? However, analog is the way to go. If you are going to implement the spiking neural networks, the only advantage you have to implement them in digital technology is that you are able to obtain measurements, to do study, to do research, right? Because all of our computers are digital now. If you do a fully analog device, uh, you have to rely on digital current technology. When I state current as actual, as the devices I have today in the lab to do the measurements, to do studies, to perform analysis, right? So, however, if you want to properly implement spiking neural networks, you have to go full analog. As you can see here, remember at the start of this presentation there was a slide with a lot of neuron models. Each one of those neuron models have a circuit representation. Of course, the Hodgkin-Huxley, which is the most complex one, the circuit representation is, I think, at least 100 transistors. Here is the leak integrate amplifier in transistor. The idea is that you have the input current flowing over here. This capacitance starts to charging, and here you encounter this thyristor, this SER, which gate is controlled by this resistance, and the voltage of this node relies on the charge of this capacitance. When you hit the certain threshold value of this thyristor, the current starts flowing onto this side and escapes over here. In this node feeds the gate of this this transistor, which acts as a firing detector, and this uses an output buffer, just two inverters tied together, you see? So the idea is that, as you can see here, the voltage starts accumulating to the capacitance, hits the threshold value of the SECR, and depletes. At the same time, the spike happens here at purple. So why are these two devices are needed? Because used for recomposition of the signal. Of course, we can use the purple signal, and it resembles more the dynamics of the brain. However, what if you need rectangular shaped spikes? But of course, you can remove them if you don't want to. The idea is that you can select the feeding voltage of these buffers to fully personalize the amplitude of the spikes. Because maybe your memristors, or well, we haven't even talked about memristors, your synapses will trigger with certain voltage values that are not provided by this initial configuration. So this circuit, of course, SER is not implementable of CMOS. However, this circuit variation is. As you can see, it is the same thing. However, instead of a thyristor, you are implementing an architecture such as this. And this is the implementation on CMOS. As you can see, what's the catch? This 1 picofarad capacitance is larger than the rest of the device. So maybe we can do a trick like I did in the SAR, that you can uh, implement these capacitors as a mean capacitor in the top of layers, maybe in between layer 4 and 3, and the rest of the device implemented in lower layers of the technology, right? This is a way to reduce space, however, fully analog. And actually, the last semester I've been working with this, I captured and I was able to obtain frequencies. I also assembled a layer of neurons, and I obtained different firing responses, right? So this is purely CMOS and it's just the neuron. Now I am start talking with memristors. Sorry, I'm going a little bit slow, but I'm trying to do the full insight. Uh, yeah, a little bit. Maybe we should stop here and yeah, yeah, sure. But what I was about to point now, maybe if you can concede 5 minutes, and maybe we can, as a cliffhanger for the next week, if you want to see it in this way. Next week in neuromorphic computing, we will explore how memristors can work as a synapse. We will explore the models of Skywater is offering, and we are planning to use into the associative processor, but also for my spiky neural networks. We will see how will be the topology that most of you are familiar with this one, but maybe you are not that familiar with this one. And also, we'll check another alternative, floating gate transistors as synapses. This chip is fully analog crossbar array and is able to perform 25 teraflops of operations in a single chip. And we are not talking about floating operation because everything is Kirchhoff current law. Okay, some chips that have already made in digital architecture, such Brain Chip and True North from IBM. We will also talk about Intel. Intel has designed this Loihi chip and also have designed a whole framework to program that Intel chip. We will explore also some tools to simulate spiky neural networks, which are available right now, so you can perform. Actually, I've used this one, which is called Nengo, on some great articles for read for newcomers. And this spider is able to learn some great skills. However, we will explore about this, and a GAN implemented in pure circuitry. So this is one of the most promising that I've run recently. This is freshly baked. So some books, and of course we can talk more in detail next session. But yeah, I think this was the theory. Yeah, sure. Yes, I think the next time we can handle this as a rather as a discussion, because you are familiar with crossbar arrays. So um, of course we can talk about this, but maybe just 10, 15 minutes and then start as a discussion, because I have some ideas about the work Kevin is doing with his with the tool he's developing, and also with Mariam regarding this Intel Loic chip and in memory computing. So maybe we can talk in the next session about this if you are interested. Okay. Thanks for your patience and for your time. Okay, bye everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Interesting.
Interesting but too long.